a man who does not understand how he was deceived will be deceived again by the same trick under a different name.
America's founders are calling. It's your opportunity to respond. This is the Liberty Brief Podcast with your host, Robert Melso, featuring Dr. Thomas Giordano. The Liberty Brief, episode 39. Tired of being told how to think. Media and political gaslighting. Welcome back to the Liberty Brief, everyone. I'm your host, Robert Melso, and this is episode 39. With me today, as always, is my partner in separating the real from the manufactured, Dr. Tom Giordano. Dr. Tom, we've got a full plate, but, I want to mention that we like to do content that is not topical. That is, it has some longevity, and we talk about concepts, but so many unprecedented events are happening today that we're going to dive into some recent events just because it'll help us illustrate what's happening conceptually, and we need to bring that out. Is that okay with you?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, everything seems to be coming to a head and exemplifying itself clearly over different topics. It's all coming to a head right in our time. It's interesting times that we're living in.
So I want to talk about Unite the Kingdom March in London. Keir Starmer, one of my favorite leaders.
Okay.
And what many are calling an outright declaration of war on his own people.
Yeah.
Their media and our ongoing campaign against Donald Trump, the question of Iran, and the thing that runs underneath all of it that maybe we're not seeing, the adaptive, shape-shifting nature of anti-Semitism in the modern West. So Tom, welcome back.
It's good to be here, Rob.
I don't think we need to welcome you again.
Yeah, well, it's still good to be here. My father, your Uncle Buster, had a saying that I've quoted in the introduction to the book that I've been working on. He said, "A man who does not understand how he was deceived will be deceived again by the same trick under a different name." And I've thought about that saying every week for the past year, because the trick is running on every front simultaneously right now. London, Washington, Tehran, different stages, but it's the same architecture.
Well, and that's the book I want to mention right up front because our audience needs to know it's coming.
Okay.
The working title is The Adaptive Nature of Hate, Historical Observations and Evaluations of Anti-Semitism.
Right.
So, Tom, I'm going to ask you to give our listeners a sense of what that thing is, because when I sat down with the pre-printed revision draft in March of 2026, I wasn't prepared for the scope of it.
Well, it is a follow-up on The Sovereign Self, which is a book that I just got finished writing, and it's in the pre-print stage right now. But I had to follow up on something because I noticed the patterns that were in that book. I applied it to anti-Semitism. And the book does three things, basically. First, it gives the degradation of the Jewish people a precise vocabulary, which sounds academic until you realize that without a precise vocabulary, you really cannot identify the thing when it shows up in a new costume. Second, it applies a measuring instrument I developed in my previous book, The Sovereign Self, called the Personhood Index. And the index evaluates 5 domains: autonomy, dignity, agency, privacy, and continuity. It assigns a score applied across 15 historical milestones over 22 centuries, from Alexandria in 38 AD through the present Western diaspora. It shows that the same architectural pattern repeats. The score changes, the mechanism does not. The third purpose is one that made the other two necessary. I want to shine a light on what anti-Semitism looks like when it has shed the theological costume it wore in the Middle Ages and the racial scientific costume of the 19th century and has put on a political costume. Today, it presents itself as progressive, as the defense of the oppressed, and that borrowed authority, that stolen coat of anti-colonialism and human rights, gives it a protection the earlier forms never had. When you attack the hate, they say you're attacking values. That is the mechanism, and it's running in London right now today.
Okay, that's the perfect segue, Dr. Tom. Let's go to London, which is where we were headed anyway. The Unite the Kingdom March.
Right.
Now, I followed it a little bit. For anyone that's been reading the mainstream coverage, the headline was essentially, quote, far-right extremists descend on London. Thousands of police deployed. Starmer vows to use the full force of the law. That was the frame. But as you and I both know, oftentimes there's more beneath that frame. Tom?
Yep.
Give it a go.
Yeah, there is. There is. And the frame itself is the story. What Peter Blexley, a former Scotland Yard detective, a man who spent his career actually identifying dangerous people, described when he was there in person, was an overwhelmingly joyous, unifying gathering of patriotic, law-abiding, hardworking, tax-paying British citizens. You know, working men and women, families, people who drove through the night to be there because they felt that someone in authority needed to hear from them. He called them, I think he called them alarm clock Britons. That's the term he used, alarm clock Britons. They're people who get up early, they do their jobs, they pay their taxes, ask relatively little from their government in return, and have watched for years as that government looked through them as though they did not exist, as though they were invisible.
You mean they didn't have pre-printed signs, water bottles, paint bottles,
No. No.
rocks and things, bricks
No,
handed to them?
none of that. None of that.
Oh, doesn't sound right.
No, all they had was the Union Jack and the flags from where they came: Scotland, Wales, Ireland. They had the Iranian Lion and Sun flag, the real Iranian flag. There were people flying the American flag, flying the Israeli flag. You know, so you know, how did Starmer frame them? How did he frame them in the news? You know, he comes out.
If I recall, the framing from Starmer and the BBC, well, really every major outlet, was uniform. These were far right marching extremists, thugs. You know, they were characterized before anyone had even thrown a single punch, before the march had even started in some cases.
Yeah. That's called assertion stacking. Okay. Starmer went to the microphone on Friday and he layered, obviously, we all know, everyone agrees, until the listener was registering a manufactured consensus rather than a claim that could be tested. Yeah, you don't need evidence when you've already told the people that asking for evidence is itself evidence of ignorance. Okay, that's epistemic closure. Okay, you know, there are terms, people know what these things are. The room is rigged before the public even walks in. The label far right is buried in the sentence as a grammatical assumption, not as a claim requiring proof. It's presupposition. The media does not say allegedly far right. They say, oh, the far right march, full stop.
Well, obviously, everyone knows that.
Oh,
Everyone
yeah,
agrees.
sure. Everybody knows that. You know, it's so
I'd like to bring in a specific example. There was a caller on Talk TV, a man named Jason.
Yes, I heard it. Yeah, Jason. Yeah, right.
Yeah, this guy called in from Warsaw. He's a truck driver, British truck driver.
Right.
Now, he pulled an all-nighter driving to Glasgow and back, and he was so angry at Starmer's statement that he jumped in his car, drove to London just to stand there and be counted.
Yeah, yeah. I heard the caller. Right. Jason, he's the invisible person. That's the specific term I would use for the working class citizen whose reality the elite have decided not to see. His fuel costs are climbing. His hours are being cut. He lives in a genuinely multicultural area of Britain and gets along perfectly with all of his neighbors. He said as much on the phone. His concern is about illegal immigration, about a government that does not seem to govern, in his interest, about a country that is changing in ways he did not vote for and did not agree with. He didn't agree to it. And his prime minister went to the microphone and called him a thug, not by name, but by category. And that categorization is the mechanism. Once you are categorized, you can be managed. My father understood that distinction precisely. Being disliked is one thing. Being managed is something quite different. Being managed means an institution has already decided what your category is permitted to do, and you find yourself in that category whether you consented to it or not.
Yeah, it reminds me a little bit of what happens here from time to time.
Oh, yeah.
We're all put into categories.
Sure.
Black, white, Hispanic, gay, whatever.
Right.
Straight. And then the contrast, Tom, this is where it becomes impossible to explain away. While Starmer was dispatching 4,000, count them, 4,000 police officers to manage, as you say, the patriotic march, 4,000 drafted from all forces from all over the country.
Right.
While that's happening, the pro-Palestinian marches in London over the preceding months have featured what can only be described as genocidal chanting.
Yeah.
You know the sayings, from the river to the sea, death to Jews, crowds calling for the obliteration of a whole race of people in the streets of one of the great capitals of the Western world.
Yeah.
And, of course, the police response to that was completely restrained to the point of perhaps even you could classify it as invisibility.
Hey, two-tier Keir. Two-tier Keir. That kind of policing is the operational signature of a two-tier political reality. Starmer says he will act aggressively, decisively against hatred. The word decisively is doing the work there, right? He does act decisively against one category, against what I call the political outliers, the working class citizens who are categorized as having the wrong concerns, the wrong politics, the wrong class identity. Against them, yes, decisive. Proactive arrests, robust preparation, the full force of the law. Against chanting for the extermination of the Jews on the embankment, hesitation, procedural caution, proportionality concerns, fear of being called anti-Muslim, a striking reluctance to make anyone's evening uncomfortable. It's interestingly, in the book that I'm writing right now, I trace this exact pattern to Alexandria in 38 AD. It was the very first documented historical event in which the Jews were targeted and assaulted by the Greek community living in the city. Aulus Aemilius Flaccus, the Roman prefect, did not create the mob's hostility toward the Jewish community. What he did was create a legal condition under which that hostility could be acted upon without consequence. Okay? Without consequence. That's the key. He issued an edict declaring the Jews to be foreigners, deprived them of civic standing they had held in Alexandria for 3 centuries. He did not need to order the violence. The legal reclassification was sufficient. When you remove a group standing in the civic order, the machinery of social harm operates on its own. Now, Starmer is not Flaccus, all right? The analogy is not direct, but the tool is the same tool. Label a group as outside the acceptable civic compact, and the consequences follow without anyone needing to issue an explicit order.
And and the violence will follow. You call that the parchment trick in the book.
Right. You're right. Well, actually, I'm quoting my father. Yeah, the parchment trick is when an official document, an edict, a decree, a piece of legislation, a speech from the prime minister accomplishes something that direct action would not be permitted to do. You cannot arrest a man for being worried about immigration, but you can classify his attendance at a march as participation in far-right extremism. You cannot silence a political objection, but you can reclassify the person as a threat to public order. The parchment does the work. Flaccus used parchment. Starmer uses a press conference. The architecture is recognizable once you know what you're looking at.
Okay, I think we've got the basic idea here. Can we go deeper into the anti-Semitism piece, Tom, because it connects directly to what we're seeing in Britain? Now, having read the book, you make the distinction between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. Specifically, you argue that anti-Zionism has become the contemporary form's best disguise.
Right.
We're not against Jews, we're against Israel's actions.
Or against the existence of the state of Israel. And the
Right.
distinction is important. And the confusion between them is deliberate. Legitimate political criticism of any state, including Israel, is not anti-Semitism, full stop. But Israel makes decisions I disagree with. Israel's government, like every government, is subject to criticism. The question is whether the criticism operates by the same standards applied to any other country in comparable circumstances. Now, there was a writer who escaped the Gulag, named Natan Sharansky. He's a man who spent 9 years in a Soviet prison for the offense of wanting to go home. Imagine. He developed a 3-point diagnostic test that cuts through the noise. He called it the 3 Ds: demonization, double standards, and delegitimization. When criticism of Israel relies on any of these 3, it is crossed out of political analysis and into something much older.
So when Israel acts to defend itself against those horrific actions, and you don't call Hamas out on it, but you call Israel out on it, that's a double standard.
Of course it is.
As an example.
Well, even take another example. Suppose the same thing had happened to Italy. Suppose, I don't know, somebody up in Austria decided that they're going to come in and kill 1,200 Italians. And the Italian government had reacted the same way the IDF acted in Israel. No one would have batted an eye. The international community would have said, yeah, you got all the right to do it. They invaded your country. They killed your people. Yeah. But with Israel, it's a double standard. Right?
All right. Why don't you walk us through these 3? I think you called them demonization. Was it double standards? And what was the other one?
Delegitimization. Right.
Yeah. Walk us through those 3 because I think our audience would benefit.
Okay. Demonization first. Okay. When media coverage constantly compares the Israeli military operations to Nazi genocide, and I've seen the comparison made in mainstream British and American newspapers on the air, in the media. They are not making an historical argument. They are deploying the most extreme negative attribution in the contemporary moral vocabulary. They're not saying Israel's policy is wrong. They are saying Israel occupies the same immoral position as the regime that built Auschwitz. That is not criticism. That is a specific technique for withdrawing moral legitimacy, and its purpose is to clear the ground for what comes after. All right?
Yeah, who wouldn't want to prevent Auschwitz?
Well, the Israelis want to prevent it.
But that's the thinking that's
Oh,
involved.
exactly.
You can act in any way you want because you're actually preventing the horror. Tom, let me ask you this question. What would you say to those who believe Israel has overplayed its response, that the Israeli military could perhaps now be accused of genocide against Palestinians, that they've become just like the Palestinians and could themselves be accused of war crimes. What would you say to people who fall back on the genocide claim?
On that Israel is committing genocide against the Palestinians? It's a bogus claim. And let's just talk numbers. Let's take the emotion out of it, okay? On May 14th, 1948, at midnight of the 13th, midnight on the 14th, the state of Israel was handed over to them, or the land was handed over to what is now the state of Israel by the British Protectorate, by the British Crown, okay? If we go back to 1948 and look at the numbers, at the time, from the river to the sea, all right, the people who would now claim to be Palestinian today, there were approximately 1 million of them. 1 million, okay? As soon as midnight came on the 14th, Israel was attacked on all sides by the Arab armies of every state around it, okay? When the war ended for the formation war, the foundation war ended, approximately 700,000 so-called Palestinians had left the area, leaving about 300,000. This is 1948. Do you know how many Palestinians are in Israel proper and in the West Bank and in Gaza today?
I don't know.
Approximately 7 million. So you tell me what kind of a genocide has a population growing from 300,000 to 7 million in an 80-year period? Does that sound reasonable to you? The state of Israel itself has approximately 10 million people. 78.5% of that is Jewish. Okay, they're Jews. 21.5 are Arab Muslims. All right, there's no apartheid there. Arab Israelis occupy every single position that they're capable of occupying within the Israeli government, in the professions. There are judges that are Arabs. There are people in their Knesset that are Arabs. They have approximately almost 3 million people, 2.5 million people that are Muslims living in Israel proper. There are 2 million living in Gaza. Okay, there are approximately 3 million living in the West Bank. Now, let me ask you a question. We heard from Hamas themselves, from their Ministry of Health, or their agency of health. I don't know what the hell you would call it, but we heard from them. That was the source. I think this was a couple months ago, that the total number of killed in Gaza was approximately 50,000 people. Now, they didn't distinguish between civilians and Hamas soldiers. They later came out and said 30,000 Hamas fighters were killed. That left 20,000 civilians that were killed. Okay? Now, if you go to the UN and you ask them, what is the state of their infrastructure today? They would tell you that approximately 72% of their buildings are completely flattened. All right? Now, let's think about this clearly. There are 2 million people in Gaza. It's the most densely populated place. It's like the size of Camden County, okay? And it's got 2 million people in it. If 72% of the infrastructure is destroyed, wouldn't you expect to be, to have a number that is a little bit more than 20,000 civilians? Wouldn't you expect 72% of that 2 million to have been injured or killed? And the reason that they're not is because Israel, the IDF, warns people where they're coming. They phone them. millions of phone calls. They text them by SMS messages. They indicate to them the safe corridors for them to leave the area where they're coming in to do demolition work. Okay, that's why the numbers are not as high as they normally are. You know, if we go back to the Second World War, over 80% of the 52 million casualties of the Second World War were civilian. They were civilian casualties. We have a ratio in Gaza that is about 1-to-1, one civilian death for every one Hamas fighter. Okay? You show me another war that was fought with that much restraint. And I'm not even talking about the 160 million tons of food that the Israelis escorted into Gaza to feed the Gazans that was taken from them by Hamas. I'm not talking about the million vaccines that they gave to Hamas children, okay? Nobody mentions this stuff. Nobody mentions the fact that the water that Gaza has is coming from Israel. They didn't cut it off. I mean, they are acting with the most, how can I say this, with the most moral restraint as possible to avoid civilian casualties. Whereas the Hamas fighters, it is their intention to kill civilians in Israel. That is their intent. So when they sit there and they say, oh, well, they're becoming like Hamas and all that, that's a load of crap, because it's the intent that says everything. The immorality of war always begins with the aggressor. The person defending themselves is not immoral. They would be immoral if they didn't defend their people. All right? So, you know, okay, you asked me. Apartheid. There's no apartheid in Israel. I'll tell you where apartheid is over there. Gaza. There's not one single Jew living in Gaza. You know, you look at these numbers and you say, where are they coming up with this propagandized bullcrap? So, in any case, that's my answer. If it is a genocide, it is the worst genocide in the history of mankind. Not only that, but their birth rate is higher. Their birth rate is up like something like 30% in Gaza during this conflict.
I think you might to say that it is the most ineffective genocide.
Yeah, well, okay. Yeah, well, you know, if it is to be called genocide, it's the most ineffective genocide in the history of mankind. That's all I have to say about that claim.
So
but all you have to do is look at the numbers.
You've unmasked them. It's basically anti-Semitism in disguise.
They are accusing the victim of being the aggressor. Israel is the victim here, not Hamas.
All right. I think that was well put. Thank you.
Oh, you're quite welcome. Yes, we'll get to double standards now. Double standards is the one most people actually recognize, though they don't always have a vocabulary for it. Israel is held to a standard of conduct in warfare that no other nation in recorded history has been required to meet, including nations whose conduct in comparable conflicts make Israel look restrained by any empirical measure, right? The media demands exhaustive, verified evidence for every Israeli military claim, while reporting Hamas, casualty figures provided by an organization whose strategic interest lies in maximizing, the reported toll as an established fact without requiring any verification. This is asymmetric skepticism. It is not a reporting error. It is consistent editorial policy. Okay. Then we get to the delegitimization. It's the third D, all right? And it is the most significant because it addresses the foundational question. The argument is not that Israel's government has done wrong things. The argument is that Israel has no right to exist as a state at all. From the river to the sea is not a territorial compromise position. It is a statement that the political architecture of the Jewish state should be dissolved, okay? And my book argues, the book that I'm writing argues, and I will state it here as plainly, as I stated on the pages, that the state of Israel has an absolute right to exist and thrive, not as a geopolitical preference, not as a tribal loyalty, but as a structural necessity. It is the only political architecture in the 22nd century record that was designed from its foundation specifically to enforce the conditions that the Personhood Index measures. Every other protection available to Jewish communities in the documented record was extended by someone else's tolerance and revocable by someone else's decision. This is what the score across 15 historical milestones shows, okay? The alternative has been tried in every available form, and the evidence is in.
Okay, and this is where hatred for Israel that's somehow shielded in a costume becomes so dangerous. The old forms, the theological costume from the Middle Ages, the idea that where they said that the Jews had killed Christ and therefore needed to be held to account.
Right.
And then there was the racial science costume of the 19th century, the idea that Jews were an inferior race.
Right. The Darwinian scientific rationalism. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
You could name them. This new form announces itself as justice.
Yeah. That is precisely the mechanism. The theological costume said Jews were guilty of deicide, the murder of God. It was a cosmic crime that they committed. And that charge was embedded in the official teaching of the church from at least the 4th century onward. My chapter on the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD traces exactly how that charge was institutionalized. But by the mid-20th century, that costume was discredited by the Holocaust, okay? The racial scientific costume, the one that dressed ancient hostility in the language of Darwinian biology and ethnographic measurement, was burned to ash in Nuremberg with the Nuremberg laws, okay? You could not put either of those costumes on again in the post-war West without being immediately recognized. So the costume changed, all right? The new one is stitched from the most morally authoritative fabric available in the contemporary West, right? Anti-colonialism, human rights, solidarity with the oppressed. It borrows the vocabulary of civil rights movements, right? It borrows the imagery of apartheid, South Africa, which is a historical comparison so badly distorted that it requires its own chapter to dismantle, and I give it one, all right? The effect is that attacking the anti-Semitism feels like you're attacking human rights, okay? The borrowed coat protects the thing wearing it, and that protection is the reason the current form is, in some respects, more durable than its predecessors. Because if you attack civil rights, you must be a monster, okay?
So if we put on this armor, we can act with relative impunity, even though deep down we're acting in a racial hatred for these folks.
Well,
is that what you're saying?
It's just a different mask for the same hatred. All right. Now I realize we have to step back a bit. All right. Because I realize that there is a subsection of the Jewish community that does not recognize the state of Israel, but for honestly held religious belief, we discount their opinion. Okay. I'm talking about anti-Semitism because the Jews within the Jewish community, the Hasidim, the Orthodox, they believe that the criteria have not yet been met under biblical interpretation for the creation of the state of Israel. All right. But they're not, advocating for going in there and killing every Jew that's there. Okay. They're just saying, we think you're wrong, but they're not advocating for the death and destruction of the Jewish people. Okay. So,
Okay, let's get back to this borrowed coat. So it's protecting people. And we see this in real time in Britain, where the people chanting death to Jews on the embankment are treated by the political class as protected political expression,
right.
while the people waving Union Jacks are treated as a threat to public order.
Exactly. That is what my father called the two-window contract. Okay. The government shows one version of justice to its progressive constituency and a different version to the citizens it has categorized as politically inconvenient. Okay. The progressive constituency receives the grammar of legitimacy. Their protests are referred to as demonstrations. Their concerns are treated as human rights advocacy. Right? Their chants are contextualized as, oh, it's passionate expression.
Mostly peaceful protests.
Yeah, mostly peaceful protests, right? The alarm clock Britons are extremists, and their presence on the streets of their own capital is framed as a public order emergency. The same act framed with different grammar. Okay. This is not a coincidence. This is editorial and political policy.
All right. Let's cross the Atlantic, shall we?
Yeah. Okay.
Because I think the same mechanism you're describing in Britain is operating at full speed against Donald Trump. Specifically, I want to get into what the administration has been doing with Iran.
Yeah.
Because there's a level of strategic calculation in the communications that the media is either, I guess, incapable of or actively choosing not to read.
Yeah. The media's misreading of Trump is, at this point, is so consistent and so predictable that it has ceased to be a reading error and must be understood as a choice. Okay. When Trump posts something on Truth Social at 11 o'clock at night that sounds like a threat, and 2 days later a diplomatic opening follows, the honest analyst asks, was the sequence calculated? When the same pattern repeats itself over the years and across multiple foreign policy situations, the honest answer is yes. You are looking at a deliberate communications architecture, not an erratic man with a telephone. In other words, it's a planned strategy.
The absolute outrage of something that he said that does in fact sound outrageous, but it brings about the change that he was aiming for at the very beginning.
Right. There is a tactic there. It's a psy-op tactic, not aimed for us, not aimed for, the West. It's aimed directly at the leaders, or the so-called leaders of what's left of them, of the IRGC in Iran. These people are morons. And they,
they're not morons. They're actively participating in a political structure in accordance with their thinking.
He's sowing division within their ranks, and they're killing each other over it. Okay. That's what these that's what these pauses are. And I was going to attack yesterday, but I figured my buddy over in Saudi Arabia, he called me. He said, how about if you hold off a couple of days? This is a tactic. Iran can gain nothing. It can only lose, and Trump knows that.
All right, let's go to another example: the killing of Soleimani in January 2020.
All right, yeah.
Well, the media reaction was, of course, predictable and uniform. Trump just started World War III.
Oh, yeah. World War III. We're going to die.
Same thing when we attacked Venezuela.
Yeah.
Same thing when he threatened to take over Greenland.
Oh, how about when he moved the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem? Well, you don't know what you're going to make the entire Muslim world rise up. Nobody said a peep.
I remember reading those headlines and thinking, do these people understand what Soleimani actually was, what he did?
No, they didn't understand. They didn't know. Soleimani was the commander of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Quds force. He was not a diplomat or a politician. He was the operational architect of the Iranian proxy warfare across the Middle East for the better part of 3 decades. Okay. The 1994 bombing of the Amia Jewish Community Center in Buenos Aires killed 85 people, has been attributed to an operation he oversaw. The network of militias in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Syria, and Yemen that conducted thousands of attacks on American personnel and on Israeli citizens, he built and ran that network. He was in Baghdad on the night he died, meeting with Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis, the commander of the Kataib Hezbollah, an organization directly responsible for the deaths of American soldiers. The media described his elimination as a reckless escalation. My father would have had a word for that framing. He would have said they started the clock in the wrong place.
Yeah, that seems to be a recurring theme, the selective clock. History has no meaning. It's what happened yesterday.
Right.
Or you start the story at the moment of the strike and everything looks like a provocation.
Yeah, and you know,
historical context.
Exactly. And you omit the 47-year record of the Islamic Republic's conduct. You know, the 1979 seizure of the American embassy in Tehran and the 444 days American diplomats were held hostage. The 1983 Beirut barracks bombing that killed 241 American Marines. The decades of funding for Hamas and Hezbollah and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, the arming of the Houthi forces in Yemen, who have launched missiles at civilian shipping and Israeli population centers, the nuclear program that under the cover of the JCPOA negotiations continued its development. If your story begins with the Soleimani strike, the United States is the aggressor. If your story begins in 1979, the picture is entirely different. They declared war on us in 1979. The media chose where to set the clock. This is not a reporting accident.
And then in the current administration, you have a similar dynamic playing out with the communications around the Iranian nuclear situation. For instance, you know, Trump, he posts something that reads as bellicose. It's deliberate on his part, and the media and the opposition politicians immediately reach for the playbook. He's reckless. He's dangerous. This man will get us into war. But when you actually look at what actually happens on the ground, it's a completely different story.
Right. What you are watching is a psychological operation aimed at the Iranian regime's internal decision-making structure. Conducted.
They still have an internal decision-making structure.
What's left of it? And now, you know, so that structure, what he's doing is conducting this openly, in plain sight, in a way that the media lacks the analytical vocabulary to recognize. The Islamic Republic is not a monolithic actor. It is a collection of competing factions. The Supreme Leader's Office, the Revolutionary Guard, the elected government, the intelligence apparatus, they are in constant internal tension with one another. A message that reads as inflammatory to a CNN anchor reads as a threat assessment exercise to a colonel in the IRGC who is trying to calculate whether his position will be targeted if the situation escalates. The uncertainty is the strategy. A regime that cannot predict what its adversary will do cannot plan around it. An adversary that broadcasts its intentions in careful, calibrated diplomatic language is an adversary that, you know, that can be gamed. Trump cannot be gamed.
Straight out of The Art of War.
Absolutely.
And then there were specific posts. I'm thinking about the moment when Trump referenced 52 targets, one for each American hostage held in 1970.
Yeah.
Of course, the media went absolutely apoplectic.
Yeah, well, you know.
Threatening cultural sites, those are war crimes. And yet no one in the mainstream press paused to ask what the strategic communication purposes of that specific number was.
Oh, yeah. The number 52 was not arbitrary. It was a deliberate historical reference planted where the Iranian leadership would see it and understand it in its full context. Every senior figure in the Iranian government knows what 1979 means.
They sure do.
All right. That reference told them in language that required no translation. The man on the other side of this has a long memory and is willing to reach back 40 years to frame the current moment. That is a message about resolve and about historical depth, not a list of targets. The media reported it as the latter and ignored the former entirely. They used what I call asymmetric skepticism in reverse. You know,
Now you're
exhaustive
getting a little
skepticism.
too complicated for me.
Well, no, it's not really. It's exhaustive skepticism applied to the administration's stated intentions. Zero skepticism applied to their own interpretation of the message.
All right, let me switch topics just a little bit. We have the Abraham Accords.
Okay, yeah.
Now, this one still baffles me. What happened was unprecedented. A Republican administration brokers normalization agreements. This was unthinkable between Israel and the UAE, and between, what was it? Between Bahrain, Sudan. What was the last one?
Morocco.
4 Arab states in a single year. Unprecedented, unbelievable in a region where peace has been used as a fundraising slogan by diplomats for half a century without producing a scintilla of results. And the coverage was
muted. It was muted. Skeptical. Contextualized into near irrelevance. Phrases like, oh, well, it's limited in scope, Oh, and it doesn't address the core Palestinian issue. Oh, and, questions remain about durability. Compare the column inches devoted to the Accords with the column inches devoted to the claim in January 2020 that Soleimani's death would trigger a regional war. The war did not happen. The Accords happened. Okay? The record of the coverage reflects neither fact accurately. What the coverage reflects is a prior determination about what this administration was allowed to accomplish, and that determination controlled by editing decisions regardless of what actually occurred on the ground.
So that's the grammar of ridicule applied to foreign policy.
Yeah, applied systematically over years. The grammar of ridicule does not require mockery. It operates through emphasis and omission. An achievement is covered in 3 paragraphs on page 14 with a but in every sentence. A failure, real or alleged, gets front page and the full analytical machinery. After enough cycles of that treatment, the audience has absorbed a portrait of a man that does not correspond to the documented record, but corresponds very precisely to the portrait the editors intended to produce. My father called people who operated this way room riggers, okay? He had no patience at all for the technique, regardless of the target.
Let me ask this. Let's talk about the Iranian people themselves. This is something that seldom gets discussed. The November 2019 protests, when the regime shot somewhere between, I think it was 1,500, maybe more of its own citizens in the streets over fuel prices.
Right.
The women and the girls who had been flogging themselves into the streets for years over the compulsory hijab. We have the secular, educated Iranian middle class that has been trying to get out from under this theocracy for decades. Of course, they get almost no coverage by the press. They're invisible people on the international stage.
Yeah. Because the regime has been granted what I call the language of legitimacy, all right, by a significant portion of the Western press. The Islamic Republic is treated as a diplomatic counterpart, a state with interests and grievances that deserve to be heard and addressed. When the regime crushes its own population, that is reported as an internal matter, right? It's internal. Oh, it's none of our business. It's internal. When the Trump administration calls the regime what it is, a destabilizing terror-funding enterprise that holds its own people hostage, the press reports it as inflammatory rhetoric. The contrast is diagnostic, The regime gets diplomatic grammar. The people trying to overthrow the regime get silence. And the administration that supports the people rather than the regime gets the grammar of ridicule. It is structurally the same thing that happens in Britain with the two-tier policing. The institution grants legitimacy where it has decided to grant it and withholds it where it has decided to withhold it, and calls the result journalism or law enforcement, depending on the context. My father's saying applies directly. The trick has a different name in each venue. The architecture is exactly the same.
Okay. Tom, I want to bring this together because I think there's a risk that maybe our listeners hear these things as separate stories. Britain and Trump and Iran and anti-Semitism, they're not separate, are they? They're linked.
No, they are the same story in different costumes. And that is precisely the point my book makes over 22 centuries of evidence. The mechanism is not ideological. It does not require a particular belief system to operate. What it requires is an institution, a government, a press apparatus, a social structure that has decided to manage a population rather than represent it. Once that decision is made, the toolkit deploys itself. The selective clock tells you when the history begins. Aesthetic priming tells you how to feel before you think. Assertion stacking tells you what everybody already knows, The grammar of ridicule assigns its target, and the parchment trick provides official cover for the conclusions already reached.
And then we have the people who see through this. They're told they're paranoid, or maybe they're called conspiracy theorists or extremists.
Oh, yeah. And that's the epistemic closure. That's the last phase. When the architecture is functioning smoothly, asking for evidence itself is evidence of your deficiency. The consensus has been manufactured. Asking why it was necessary to manufacture it is, by definition, a sign that you have fallen outside the category of reasonable people, right? I watched this happen in real time during the COVID period. When any question about the origins of the virus, the efficacy of specific interventions, or the cost-benefit calculation of school closures was treated not as a scientific inquiry, but as a political allegiance. The questions were legitimate. The science was not settled on these questions, but the epistemic closure had been installed, and the questioning itself became the accusation. Okay?
Well, everyone knew, of course.
Oh, sure. Everyone knew. Except me. I didn't know.
And yet, Tom, we can see cracks in this. We can see that something's changing.
Yeah.
You wrote
fortunately
in the book about narrative leakage, the idea that the architecture is cracking.
Yeah, the architecture is under stress. It was not designed to withstand, right? The reason is that the technology of distribution has outrun the technology of control, right? When every person at a march, for example, has a camera and can post, 45 minutes of unedited footage to a platform that reaches millions of people before the edited version appears on the evening news, the gap between the managed narrative and the observable reality becomes visible in a way it never was before. Blexley went to the Unite the Kingdom March and described what he saw with his own eyes to a live audience. Jason, the van driver, the guy who called into Talk TV and said in plain language what it felt like to be called a thug by your own prime minister. These two moments existed outside the managed frame. That is narrative leakage. The frame does not disappear, but people can see around the edges of it now in a way that was genuinely impossible in 1935 or in 1985.
Irredeemables, aren't they?
Oh, of course.
Okay. But the institutions, well, they're not standing still. They're adapting. They're pushing for, speech regulation, for platform control, for a redefinition of what the word harm means, to include things that are merely inconvenient to the people in power.
Yeah.
We see Great Britain arresting people for speech or thought crimes.
Right. You write a meme in Great Britain, you're in prison for 2 years.
That's no fun.
It might insult somebody. These institutions are doing exactly what institutions do when their legitimacy is under pressure. They reach out for more control. The Online Safety Act in Britain, perfect example. The attempts to define misinformation, quote unquote, in ways that grant the defining authority to the entities most invested in managing the information. All right. These are not new strategies. The protocols of the elders of Zion, that fabricated piece of crap document that the Russian secret police used to manage its population at the turn of the 20th century, was the information operation of its era. Today, it has a digital equivalent. The algorithm delivers the managed reality at a speed that makes the selective clock of the old broadcast media look like a sundial by comparison. The speed does not change the mechanism. It amplifies it.
All right. So what are we to do with all of this? Your father said a man who does not understand how he was deceived will be deceived again, right? What does understanding that actually look like in practice?
Well, it looks exactly like what my father, your Uncle Buster, taught me to do at the kitchen table in Cherry Hill, New Jersey, when I was 16. You ask where the clock started. You ask whose evidence is being scrutinized and whose is being taken at face value. You ask yourself, what is not being shown in the photograph? Whose suffering is visible and whose was made invisible? You ask whether the standard being applied to this group would be applied to any other group in comparable circumstances. You ask yourself, what would have to be true about the person making the argument for them to be making it? Because the institutional interest is always present and almost never declared. All right? This is not paranoia. This is what a functioning mind looks like when it is engaging in, with contested information. My father did it with a natural facility because he had grown up in a neighborhood where the gap between what people said and what they meant was navigated before breakfast every morning. South Philadelphia in the 1930s was not a place that, that rewarded credulity. He brought that faculty to bear on Hayek and Bastiat and Augustine with the same directness he brought to a card game. The tool is available to anyone. The book is an attempt to hand it to people who didn't grow up with, Buster Giordano at the kitchen table.
Well, I think we need to close, and I want to close on one specific point, Tom, because I think it's the most important thing we've said today. The anti-Semitism piece, it connects everything. The two-tiered policing in Britain, one tier for patriots, one for people chanting death to Jews. We have the media's treatment of Iran. The regime gets diplomatic grammar. The people who want to be free from it get silence. We see the attacks on Trump whenever he does something that benefits Israel or confronts Tehran. These aren't and never were coincidences.
No, they're not. They're not. And the book that I'm writing now traces that non-coincidence across 22 centuries. The machinery is not identical at every point in the record. It operates differently under Roman provincial administration than under medieval canonic law than under 19th century racial science, than under the contemporary progressive political framework. But the score it produces on the personhood index follows a pattern. When two foundational criteria, legal standing and recognition as ends, score 0 simultaneously, the other protections are merely cosmetic. They exist on paper. They do not have operative force. What I argue in the conclusion is that the state of Israel exists precisely because the 22nd century record shows, with as much clarity as historical record can show anything, that paper protections extended by someone else's tolerance are revocable by someone else's decision. The Constitution that is yours, that you hold yourself, that does not depend on the goodwill of the current prefect or the current prime minister, that is the structural answer the record points to, all right? And that answer has enemies here. You can tell who they are by watching which direction they aim the grammar of ridicule.
Okay, I hope that's a clear statement about the stakes, and I think it's as clear as we can make it. So, The Adaptive Nature of Hate, your book. I want everyone listening to mark that title down, The Adaptive Nature of Hate, because this book is going to matter. It's going to matter. It's a diagnostic tool. We need to read the costume, not just react to whoever happens to be wearing it this week.
Yeah, well, that's the goal. The machinist who refuses to look at the problem squarely will eventually see the machinery shear a shaft. You know? We owe it to the record to look directly at the architecture. That's all the book is asking you to do. But there's another thing. It will give you the ability to question why you think what you think about the Jewish people and the state of Israel, and whether that thought is rational or not.
All right. Well, that's episode 39. The room is unrigged for today, and we'll be back next week. Don't let them nudge you into a reality that doesn't exist. Thanks for listening. You've been listening to The Liberty Brief, based on the book Unalienable, What It Really Means and Why It Matters by Dr. Thomas Giordano. If you want to help spread the word, please subscribe, like, and share using the links below. You can also check out Dr. Giordano's book on Amazon using the links as well.